You don't have tattoos anywhere.
No. Honey, would you put a bumper sticker on a Bentley? We have lots of TikToks.
I feel like I could be Batman. I feel like you could be Batman.
A viral Halloween clip, a handful of TikToks, and suddenly the Kardashian family is embroiled in another optics fire. Kanye West reportedly erupted over North West's temporary tattoos and faux piercings, tabloids splashed dramatic images, and critics started asking whether Kim Kardashian is exploiting her child for content, while Kris Jenner allegedly scolded her. I will walk the receipts, what happened in the videos, what reputable outlets reported, what tabloids amplified, how Kanye reacted in public, what Kim said in defense, why the Kris beat spread, and what this reveals about parenting, power, and PR. I'll cite everything and flag the tabloids. Multiple outlets reported that North West posted short videos where she dressed up as popular Twitch streamers for Halloween. Braided blue hair, temporary face tattoos, a faux septum ring, and black grills, and imitated streamers' mannerisms in a bit that was clearly homage and costume play. The Times of India documented the clip and explained how mimicry in a Halloween context can go viral and be misread without context. Those raw visuals are the primary artifacts at hand, a child copying cultural figures, not an obviously permanent transformation. Once the clip circulated, reaction bifurcated almost immediately. One camp praised North's comedic timing and playful audacity, calling it clever and inventive. Another camp recoiled, uncomfortable with adult-adjacent cues on a child's face, even if the effects were temporary. That binary frames the debate. Is this childhood play or a problematic public performance? The answer often depends less on the clip itself than on prior narratives about the family and about celebrity parenting more broadly. Kanye West's involvement escalated the story from a viral clip to national attention. Several outlets summarized his public expressions of alarm about North's social media presence and the way she is portrayed. Yahoo aggregated moments of Kanye's public rhetoric and framed his statements as expressions of parental concern over premature exposure. The Tribune framed the clash as part of an ongoing dispute, noting that this episode is another installment in a long-running, very public co-parenting saga. Those pieces anchor the story in a pattern of public disagreement rather than a private spat. Kim Kardashian's defense was swift in trade reporting. Sources such as People and E! quoted her framing the look as a temporary costume play and imitation, normal for a child enjoying Halloween, she and her defenders argued. That defense matters because it situates the visuals within a specific context, imitation, not permanent modification. If you strip away tabloid language, the documented facts show temporary effects used for a themed clip rather than substantive, permanent changes. Tabloid outlets, of course, chose a different editorial posture. The Daily Mail published saturated photo spreads and emphatic captions emphasizing faux piercings and face tattoos. Page 6 rounded up critics and defenders in quick sweeps. Tabloid frames tend to magnify outrage because outrage drives engagement. This is why labeling those outlets as tabloid in any critical piece is not gatekeeping but basic source discipline. Sensationalism is not the same as sober verification. So what can we verify? The most reliable facts in public reporting are a viral clip in which North imitates streamers, public reports that Kanye expressed alarm about her portrayal, and statements from Kim's defenders that explain the look as temporary and aesthetic play. Everything else, claims of permanent body modification or court filings about visitation, requires explicit sourcing and documentary evidence. Let's unpack why the moment resonated. North West is not a private child in the way most children are. She is the child of two hyper-public parents whose images and brands operate in a media economy that rewards novelty and spectacle. When a child raised in that environment posts content, audiences read more than play. They read branding choices, parental strategy, and sometimes, where none exist, a case study in exploitation. Critics argue that Kim's long history of curated imagery creates an incentive structure that privileges attention. The structural critique is simple. If your enterprise monetizes exposure, you have economic reasons to produce content that performs. Observers point to a pattern of publicized moments involving North and argue that a pattern, repeated operations of exposure, is more meaningful than any isolated clip. That argument is evidence grounded insofar as it refers to repeated public moments. It becomes an allegation only when one asserts deliberate, malicious intent without proof. But nuance is essential. The legal and evidentiary record does not support claims of permanent modification. No reputable outlet has published court documents showing Kim authorized permanent tattoos or piercings for North. Most reporting describes temporary effects used in costume context. Distinguishing permanence from temporary makeup is not rhetorical hair splitting. It's the difference between an allegation of harm and an account of performative costume. The Kris Jenner beat is irresistible to gossip engines. Kris is a stage mother, a manager figure, and the architect of the family's brand. But is there verified evidence that Kris physically confronted Kim about North's look? Trade reporting mentions family tension and management friction, but eyewitness confirmation of a dramatic on-camera confrontation is lacking in reputable outlets. A lot of the Kris versus Kim copy is plausible narrative embroidery rather than sourced fact. If you see headlines that announce a verbatim confrontation, ask for the source. Why do readers want Kris in the frame? Because the family's reality programming has trained audiences to see Kris as the central node who coaches and occasionally scolds. The narrative logic is tidy. If a child's look is controversial, the manager matriarch must intervene. That causal shortcut is clean storytelling, but journalism requires more verification than thematic neatness. Fans on social platforms supplied the emotional horsepower for the story. X and Reddit lit up with two obvious camps: pro-Kanye protectiveness and pro-Kim contextual defense. Some users accuse Kim of exploiting her child. Others accuse Kanye of grandstanding. Those reactions are valuable social data points because they show public sentiment, but they are not evidence of parental intent or legal wrongdoing. The gendered double standard surfaced repeatedly in commentary. Mothers who curate family imagery are more quickly labeled negligent than fathers who voice criticism are labeled protective. This asymmetry distorts public debate. When Kim posts a stylized image of her child, critics impute motive. When Kanye denounces the image, commentators sometimes treat him as the guardian of normalcy. That unevenness deserves critique and should be called out. Now consider the commercial angle. The Kardashian brand is a massive commercial engine. Images of family life feed attention that translates into product sales. Some critics argue that this reality creates incentives to include children in content. But proving intentional commodification in a specific post requires evidence. Observers have a right to demand policy reforms, contractual posting agreements, default privacy settings, rather than to leap directly to accusations of exploitation. A policy approach is useful. What if parents adopted simple posting protocols? Label costume content clearly, avoid permanent alterations without mutual parental consent, and default to limited permanence for posts featuring kids. These are low-cost adjustments that respect both parental autonomy and child welfare. Advocating for such protocols is practical and non-punitive. There's also a cultural lens argument. Imitation is how children learn. The Times of India highlighted that North imitated streamers in a Halloween clip, a specific bounded instance of mimicry. Mimicry per se is not harmful. Frequency, context, and permanence matter. When a child repeatedly appears in content that uses adult aesthetics without clear framing, alarm is more reasonable than when it's a single playful mimic. Now, about Kanye's rhetoric, the reporting shows heat and public complaint, but a public complaint is not proof of legal obstruction or malicious intent from the other parent. It's a performance of concern in the public sphere. Critics should hold Kanye's statements to scrutiny just like they scrutinize Kim's posts. What he says is news. Whether it reflects private negotiation or conflict is another question entirely. We should also weigh the international dimension. Different cultures treat children's images differently. The Times of India's coverage reflects that a clip can be read as typical Halloween play in one cultural context and alarming in another. American tabloids, with incentive structures favoring sensationalism, will often opt for the more alarming reading. International readers should adjust for that variation and seek trade reporting for context. There's a media economics angle to note. When a child's image goes viral, the attention becomes monetizable content across platforms. That dynamic exerts subtle pressure on public figures to produce more compelling visuals. It's not an indictment on parents per se, but a systemic critique. The attention economy rewards ever more provocative content, and children can become inadvertent collateral. Precedent matters too. Other celebrity parenting controversies escalated into legal disputes. Some were solved privately via mediation, others became prolonged spectacles. Lessons from precedent suggest that early private negotiation and clear public messaging usually minimize harm. Tabloid escalation rarely benefits anyone except the tabloids. When headlines invoke trauma or permanent harm in relation to a child's costume, clinical experts caution against conflating temporary aesthetic with psychological damage. Child psychologists emphasize context, intention, and frequency. A single costume performance is not longitudinal evidence of harm. That nuance matters in a balanced public conversation. Now, let's interrogate the motive with care. Accusing Kim of deliberate exploitation requires proof beyond observation. The ethical test is whether there is a pattern of permanent, monetized exposure intentionally designed to market a child. Critics can reasonably point to recurrent public moments as grounds for policy demands, but they must avoid converting every viral clip into proof of malice. Kris Jenner's purported confrontation with Kim is fodder for drama-hungry headlines, but responsible reporting demands sources. If a claim about Kris confronting Kim appears primarily in tabloids, treat it as a rumor. If trade outlets later corroborate with testimony or documented statements, then it becomes reportable as fact. Until then, it is narrative shorthand, not a court-certified sequence. The ethics of sharing matter. As commentators, we bear responsibility not to amplify such descriptions or invasive details about kids. That maxim should govern any reporting or opinion piece. If a tabloid uses such a phrase about North, journalists should place that phrase in a quoted, labeled context and avoid replication. Protection of young ones is non-negotiable. Now, let's project plausible next steps in the story. First, the family could issue a joint clarification. The clip was Halloween/cosplay and temporary. Second, private mediation could produce an agreed public guideline for posting young ones. Third, if tensions persist, tabloids will run Kris versus Kim narratives, but those will likely be editorial theater rather than evidence-based reporting. From a brand standpoint, this kind of controversy threatens soft goodwill rather than survival. If consumers begin to view family content as exploitative, brand sentiment might suffer incrementally. The fix is simple: transparency, cautious posting, and demonstrable concern for child welfare. None of these choices require stunting creative parenting. They require prudence. One recurrent mistake in public discussion is conflating anger with truth. Kanye's outrage makes for headlines, but outrage is not evidence. It is a data point that must be weighed against other data points: the clip's content, Kim's public statements, and any corroborated documentation about custody or access. Balanced analysis treats each as a piece of an evidentiary mosaic, not as a verdict. Another mistake is moral grandstanding. Viewers who leap to label Kim a bad mother often commit a logical error, using a single moment as diagnostic of a whole life. Parenting is iterative and messy. Public figures make errors in visible ways. Critiques should be proportional and focused on systemic reforms rather than personal destruction. Now, a practical reporting checklist for readers. When you see a story about a kid and a celebrity, Check whether the claim cites court records or just social media outrage. Verify whether outlets labeled as tabloids are amplifying versus reporting. And look for primary source material like a public post or quoted interview. This small discipline improves public conversation and protects young ones. A constructive public policy outcome would be a voluntary industry compact among influencers, clear labeling of children in costume content, agreed age thresholds for monetized content featuring kids, and default privacy measures. Such a compact would preserve creative family expression while reducing risks of exploitation. Let's also talk about historical framing. Celebrity families have navigated image management for decades. The Kardashians professionalized it in the social media age, which intensifies both scrutiny and commercial opportunities. That professionalization invites critique. It means family images are often curated with brand calculus in mind, not purely private affection. Such critique is valid, but should avoid conflating strategic branding with ill intent absent evidence. Another dimension is the role of legal guardianship and access. If a parent publicly alleges denied access, that is serious and requires documentation. Trade outlets reported Kanye's frustration and public complaints, but they did not publish court filings proving legal obstruction. Allegations must be interrogated. Courts are where access disputes get resolved if negotiation fails. Now, some media literacy housekeeping. Recap the reputable sources underpinning the coverage. The Times of India documented the viral Halloween clip and mimicry. Yahoo summarized Kanye's public comments and situational context. People and E! Online reported Kim's defensive statements. Tabloid coverage from Daily Mail and Page Six added sensational visuals. Treat those cautiously and label them accordingly. The evidence for alarm is a viral clip with adult-adjacent effects and public outcry from Kanye. The evidence for exploitation is circumstantial and pattern-based, not proven by any court filing or documentary evidence as cited reporting. That distinction is critical to avoid moral panic. Now let's interrogate the cultural underpinnings. The debate illuminates deeper anxieties about childhood, commodification, and the role of media in forming identity. For many viewers, the image of a child in an adult-adjacent costume triggers protective instincts. For others, it reads as harmless cultural imitation. Both responses are shaped by values and the media environment. Now, a reflection on empathy. It's easy to perform outrage from afar. It is harder to appreciate the difficulty of co-parenting under constant surveillance. The parents are human, with relationships and histories that media coverage simplifies. Empathy does not mean excusing poor choices. It means advocating for systems that reduce harm and prioritize children's well-being. Other celebrity families who adopted posting policies or partnered with child safety groups saw fewer flare-ups. Those examples show that voluntary standards can diffuse controversies and improve public perception. The Kardashian family could lead by example and craft policy responses that align public visibility with child safety. The Northwest clip is a prism, not a verdict. It reflects the collision of attention economies, parenting under surveillance, and cultural debates about childhood expression. The reasonable public response is to demand sourcing, avoid tabloid amplification, and support policy solutions that protect young ones while allowing normal childhood play. Let's add one more angle: the brand and sponsorship implications. Advertisers and brand partners keep a close watch on reputational risk. When family controversies spike, brands run sentiment analyses to determine whether association with a public figure might trigger negative backlash. For the Kardashians, who monetize credibility and glamour, even a mild erosion in public trust can ripple across product categories. That doesn't mean every viral clip will tank a brand, but it means teams should be prepared with measured responses and transparent policies. Platform responsibility is another structural lever. Social platforms have tools, age gating, default private settings for young ones, and contextual labels for content featuring children that are underused. TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube could implement simple nudges. require captions that clarify context for clips with effects that mimic adult aesthetics, or offer parental controls that limit the visibility of content featuring kids. Platform design changes can reduce the virality that converts private play into headline fodder. Also, consider the role of child safety organizations and advocacy groups. Journalists should consult independent child development experts before amplifying panic. When outlets bring clinicians into stories, frame and nuance improve. In some high-profile splits, independent experts help the public understand what actually constitutes harm versus what is an overzealous interpretation of style. That practice of consulting neutral experts should be a default newsroom protocol for stories involving young ones. Let's compare a couple of non-identifying precedents for clarity. Celebrity families who adopted posting policies saw fewer flare-ups over time. When influential figures made a public commitment to limit monetized content with their children, the narrative often cooled. Those precedents suggest a clear path. Transparency and restraint produce calmer coverage and better outcomes for young ones. Advocacy groups could compile a best practices playbook for influencer families and entertainment PR teams. Final sign-off. What do you think? Was Kanye right to publicly call out these looks, or is this another case of tabloid moral panic? Keep it civil in the comments, prioritize the child's well-being, and subscribe for updates as reputable outlets report verifiable facts. Thanks for watching!